saying good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the Hillary Term seminars organized by the Italian Evaluation Association every spring since 2000. This is the third Hillary Term promoted by our thematic group Valutare nella Cooperazione, led by Laura Fantini and I. And we have this year a special guest, as you know, from Harvard University, from the World Bank. Of course, you know me, I'm Valeria Saggiomo from University of Naples. I study and practice development since 2 decades. And our guest is Professor Woolcock, Michael Woolcock, lead social scientist at the World Bank Independent Evaluation Group, where he's probably the only sociologist among a plethora of economists, and this already gives us an idea of how hard your job at the World Bank is or might be. Also, Professor Woolcock teaches a fantastic course at the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University entitled Social Institutions and Economic Development, that I had the privilege to attend this semester, and that, alas, has just ended, and I wish it could last forever. But unfortunately, all journeys come to an end sooner or later. And I would like to spend a few words to give you a little bit of background on how this incredible journey I had the opportunity to embark on started. It was exactly 1 year ago, in May last year, that I was talking to Nicoletta Stame and Luca Meldolesi about the opportunity that my research project envisioned to spend a semester abroad. And I was thinking of going back to Africa, maybe to Somalia, to study development projects promoted by diaspora. And Nicoletta told me, smiling as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, she said, if you want to be an academic in the field of development, you must go to the United States and experience a hint of that amazing cultural atmosphere that Albert Hirschman and Judith Tendler lived a few decades ago. And I remember Luca prompting me to leave Naples immediately and to go to the US for at least 1 month, he said, and see what opportunities could arise for this forthcoming semester. And I remember him saying, go there, what are you waiting for? Go there and see what happens. And this is what I did, actually, without too much of programming. I visited places that Judith Tendler was working, where Judith Tendler was working. I talked to the people who had the fortune to meet her. And by unexpected episodes of serendipity, I met Michael Woolcock in person. I told him about my experience in Somalia, my idea of evaluation approach that could embrace the sentimental dimension of development actors. And Michael designed a space around this desire and invited me at Harvard for this semester to follow his course, to study and dedicate this time to my research. So it is thanks to the encouragement and support by Nicoletta Stame and Luca Meldolesi, thanks to the generosity of Michael Woolcock, or Professor Woolcock, thanks to the external opportunity given by COVID-19, European Recovery and Resilience Plan that funds my research. And finally, also thanks to my darling husband who's taking care of kids in Italy, that I'm here living this incredible cultural experience and I want to publicly thank all of you for making this dream possible. So this webinar is a way to share with you a bit of my fortune by listening at Professor Woolcock talking to us about his way of conceiving development, impact trajectories of change and evaluation in dialogue with my research on the role of sentiment in evaluation. And I will leave the floor to Professor Woolcock, to Michael, asking you to share with us your thoughts on how we should observe and promote social change in fragile states. What are the possible trajectories of change and how evaluation can capture this change? With what kind of tools do we need to observe this change in development space? And I told you before that I found illuminating the graph you published in your chapter on case studies to generate key facts in the recent book co-edited with Jennifer Wiedner and Daniel Ortega Nieto. So how can we detect the impact of development projects in complex context?
Thanks very much, Valeria. Thanks to all of you for giving up a Friday afternoon, which I'm sure you could find many interesting ways to spend it in Italy or wherever you are right now. Thanks for being part of this conversation. Just two little things before I start. One is that I had the good fortune of meeting Judith on several occasions. She was a not infrequent visitor to the World Bank. We would invite her there quite a lot. She and I and a bunch of other people actually got to go on a study tour to Cuba, of all places, 20 years or so ago. And so it was wonderful just to have a chance to go to a very different country that is very hard for Americans in general to go to. But Harvard being Harvard, it had friends in high and low places, and it was able to secure visas for a group of us, and then in turn secure visas for Cuban colleagues to come to Cambridge and have a rare moment where they could talk about their work to a more global audience. And so that was one of the early highlights of my career, was being able to, well, I wouldn't call it field work, but it was at least a fun trip that we had to Havana, and to seeing a city that was probably the one and only chance that any of us would have to actually go there. And it was wonderful. Just a slight correction. I don't work at the independent evaluation group at the World Bank. I work in the development research group. So it's like an academic unit, a think tank, as it were, within the World Bank. As Valerie indicated, it's 99% economists and me. So staff are about 70 people, I guess, these days. 69 of them are good, well-trained, thoughtful, very competent economists, and a rare alignment of forces in the late 1990s made it possible for me to be the first and only person to join who wasn't an economist. So whether that says more about me or them, I will let you decide. That said, once you join the World Bank, you can't help but be caught up in questions and conversations about impact, and about which leads inexorably to discussions about evaluation and the kinds of claims that we make about all different sorts of interventions, from energy and infrastructure and to cash transfers, maternal health care, empowerment of minorities. I mean, pretty much everything is now part of the development agenda, or if it's not explicitly part of the development policy agenda, it's part of the development agenda just because development by design and by definition really does change the whole situation for people. And being able to engage with and understand the different ways in which these different aspects of people's lives are changed by development seemed always to me to be a really important task. But our prevailing evaluation systems, it seems to me, did a great disservice to the complexity of what these change processes look like. And I remembered very distinctly going to my first Evaluation 101 seminar just to see how the World Bank was teaching its staff to think about what the evaluation challenge fundamentally was. And so, not surprisingly, you can imagine a single PowerPoint slide goes up, and we have baseline data of one kind or another. Time passes, and then we go back and do some follow-up data. If we're good little methodologists, we can try to control for all the other factors that might be going along in people's lives, selection effects, socialization effects, and all sorts of other things that might be leading or contributing to or undermining the outcomes that we subsequently observe. But there was an explicit assumption, really, that you get from here to there. You get from baseline to follow up in a straight line, and everything unfolds in a fairly monotonic way over the life of a project, say 3 to 5 years. But having a PhD in comparative historical sociology, I just looked at that graph and said, nothing I've ever studied anywhere got from here to there in a straight line. It went all over the place. Sometimes it took centuries for the kinds of change that people were trying to achieve to actually happen. Getting women the vote, for example, that didn't happen in a 3-year project cycle. That took centuries for people to work on that. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman back in 1792 or something like that, and many of the people on this in this
They're still there.
discussion right now will tell you very convincingly that goal hasn't been achieved yet. And does that mean, though, that previous efforts have failed, or does it just mean that certain types of problems in the world are really, really, really hard to change? And it's not because we're not smart enough. It's not because we don't try hard enough. It's not because our tools aren't refined enough. It's just that it's really, really hard to change things. Interracial marriage has took decades and decades to change in the United States and probably in many other places. Building out democracies takes a long time and is often very bloody and contentious and violent when you're trying to fundamentally alter the way that a society is structured. So to formalize all of that, I just sort of imagined 4 different scenarios where, in addition to the straight line option, which was the convention, I just imagined 3 different alternatives to that. And one of those, for example, can be what evolutionary biologists call a punctuated equilibrium, which is basically saying nothing happens until everything does. So if you think about the revolutions that have occurred across the Middle East or in Eastern Europe, and with all the different colors that are attached to all of that, those are it's like a volcano. It's a big buildup of all these pressures that doesn't look like anything's going to happen. And then boom, something really big does take place. That's how, since Stephen Jay Gould and other biologists have tried to make sense of the way that species evolve. They don't just evolve a little bit every generation. They go looking exactly the same until the genetic mutation comes along, and poof, you've got a creature that can suddenly build a cocoon around itself and turn from a caterpillar into a butterfly. All of these things are in nature, at least, aren't linear either. They can follow this other pathway. I'll think of also, just to use a more readily apparent analogy, airplanes running down a runway, right? They take a long time to take off. And if you've been in an airplane with other people, as I have been, who have literally never been on an airplane before. I was coming back from Bangladesh once with a group of very poor men who were going on their Hajj to the Middle East. This was the one big moment they've been looking forward to in their entire life. These are men, some of them in their 60s and their 70s, the one and only time they're going to be on an airplane. And these guys were just looking like ghosts on their faces as the plane was roaring down the runway. I think you could just see them with every religion conceivable. Every god in the world was being invoked to get this. I just hope this plane's going to take off. And those of us that have flown on planes 1,000 times don't even think about it, right? Because we've got an implicit theory in our head that says when the plane gets to 240 kilometers an hour, the physics overtakes gravity, and what do you know? The plane takes off. But if your only measure of success is elevation, you can be screaming down that runway like these poor Bangladeshi Hajj travelers going, we're all gonna die. This is not working. This machine's gonna just crash and burn at the end of the runway. And then suddenly we're off the ground, and this wonderland of vision takes hold as people look out the windows and see their country at a height they've never seen it before, and that wonder look on their face, oh my goodness, this is what the world looks like when you get high up in the air. Wow, isn't that amazing? Or more prosaically, if you're a horticulturalist and you're growing seeds, right? It takes 2 years for an acorn seed to germinate, to become a little tree. If I didn't have a theory underpinning what I was doing, and I put an acorn in the ground and I watered it every day, and I was very nice to it, even spoke to my little acorn and told it how wonderful it will be to welcome it when it finally pops out of the ground. And I code this every day, and after a year I keep coming back to my little plant and it hasn't done anything. Is that because the tree has failed, or because acorns just take 2 years to germinate? Whereas my neighbors are growing sunflowers, and they've got after growing their sunflower for a week, they've got a plant that's 1 foot high, and they come back after a month and it's 6 feet high, and everybody's taking photographs and saying, wow, you're a great gardener. You can grow plants that come out of the ground really, really fast. And then, isn't this fantastic? We want to have more of your kinds of flowers. And, well, in a proper garden, you have oak trees and you have sunflowers, and they just evolve and change at very different over different trajectories. Alternatively, you can do really scary projects where things get worse before they get better. I think a lot of the research on women's empowerment programs will show the first thing that will happen when you empower women is that their uppity men will start to push back and not really like a lot of this. A lot of the work on democracy promotion just results, I think, in very potentially violent pushback against all of that. Is that because you failed? You've got a negative impact. You're not just having no impact. Now you're making things worse. What do we do about that? What are the, well, then things get really hard, because maybe you're actually doing a very awful project and it should be shut down, and it's getting negative impact because it's really just not achieving what it's supposed to be achieving. Or maybe this is just the nature of this kind of change process. You're taking on a really powerful group of people, and to navigate your way out of that, you're going to have to take a lot of initial blows in order for that to eventually turn around. And the other, to use the sunflower analogy again, is just that you can have a very quick initial spectacular success that everybody thinks is fabulous and hails you as a development hero for the great impact that you've had, only to come back later on and realize that your shooting star is a shooting star. It's going to flame out and it's going to kind of die. In that space, I think we've seen a lot of recent work on nutrition supplements, for example, that seems to show very positive short-run impacts, and those are laudable, especially if they're for pregnant women or for young kids. Getting good nutrition into your body is obviously super important. But if those effects wane over time, was that initial enthusiasm unwarranted? Or did we need to have a different kind of theory that says, well, okay, we're probably going to achieve something in the short run, but this is going to just fade out if we don't do something different in the medium and long run to be able to change people's behavior or their wealth and their capacity to be able to consume a very different kind of diet. So all of what I'm saying here is really saying we have to have a theory of change, not just a very narrow internal theory of change built into a log frame that says if you do A, B, and C, and D, then you will get E. And this is in a very linear, mechanical kind of way. For these really complex interventions, I think they're going to be mostly punctuated equilibriums, lots of nothingness for a long period of time, and then maybe somehow, if you're lucky, good luck and good management will combine to produce an outcome of some kind. But that trajectory itself is going to be very non-uniform in the sense that the way it unfolds in Somalia is not going to be how it might unfold over time in Mali or in Estonia. And so you have to have a very context-specific theory of change that said, by when is it reasonable to expect that some kind of discernible outcome will be achieved? And methodology per se then doesn't solve that problem. Having a randomized control trial, having anything that where you have a well-identified causal model that would satisfy certain elite journals is just not what you need when you're trying to engage with these kinds of problems and these kinds of interventions. They are unfolding along very different pathways. And I tried to articulate that, tried to just to show very different kinds of inferencing that you would, kind of conclusions that you would draw if you were in a world where you were ignorant of your own underlying trajectory. And you could make all sorts of overinflated claims if you were in the shooting star world where you were ascribing great powers to yourself or your project or the project when that was perhaps warranted in the short run but not likely to be sustainable. Or you could be beating yourself up over an apparent non-achievement with being on this very flat part of the curve, thinking you're toiling away in obscurity, when in fact maybe you're not toiling away in obscurity. Maybe what you need is an evaluation tool that can capture a broader array of unintended outcomes, perhaps, that may be happening as a result of this intervention that in one sense produces a very flat trajectory on the income space, on the outcome space that you are formally there to assess, but nonetheless might be producing all these component parts that eventually will lead to the takeoff and will lead to a very big kind of change or a substantive, an important change occurring at a later point in time. So all of this kind of thinking was just what was my entry into the world of evaluation. It came out of my work in Indonesia that I did for many years with a big team of people looking at transformations in local democracy in the aftermath of the Suharto regime. And even within a project there, we saw trajectories that looked like all examples that I just talked about. A pro-democracy project is a very deep threat to people that have run a little fiefdom in their village for the last 25 years. And these notions of accountability, transparency, and participation, yeah, I don't think so. I like my little world here. Thank you very much. I'm not having these offers put on me to be accountable. I'm just going to keep stealing people's money that I always have. You got that. You got outcomes then where other people said, wow, finally, we get to be able to be really open and accommodating of different people. This is a real breakthrough for us. And others that sort of took a while to come around to this. They were a bit skeptical and suspicious. They didn't think this was going to really work. So they just were very passive and not really engaging fully energetically until wow, then they had a little breakthrough moment where things really were different. Money was actually arriving on time. Money was actually being spent on things that were supposed to be spent on and not just building a new pathway to the village chief's house. All of these good things were starting to happen. And once that accelerated, then lots of other good things started to happen as well. So does this intervention work? That's the big claim you have to answer if you're talking in the boardroom of the World Bank. They don't care about all these subtleties. They just want a thumbs up, down. Did it work? Did it not work? And I just think that's maybe okay for certain kinds of problems in development, but it's not a reasonable question to be asking around these very complex interventions in very difficult, challenging contexts. But we have to evaluate. We have not off the hook just because it's hard. But if it's hard, then we just need to reach into a deeper toolkit, it seems to me, of not just method, but a theory and a dialogue between those two that adds up to, I think, then both useful professional work, but one that's actually better situated to infer and apprehend what's going on in those places.
The real challenge is, when do you evaluate? Because the mismatching, there is what is interesting, I think, is that the wrong mismatching between evaluation and trajectories of change may be misleading to informing donors and policymakers decisions on projects. For example, the negative situation, the J curve. So if the one you were mentioning on women empowerment, so if you perform the evaluation when the curve is negative, then this would suggest donors to stop immediately the program, because it's going to to damage the target population. Alternatively, an evaluation along the flat curve, the one that before the takeoff, would advise the donor to stop, because they don't see any impact. It's flat. It's a flat line, which is not true. So. And this situation, I would add, is very common in fragile states where you don't see impact immediately, but suddenly, something blows and you see the change. So acknowledging how detrimental mismatching trajectories of change and evaluation performed at the wrong moment could be. What are the implications for evaluators? I mean, should we give up evaluating or trying to understand this dynamics for the fear of misinterpreting data, or what? I mean.
Well, I'd be interested in the Q&A. I'd be really interested to hear other people's views on how they've encountered, or if they have encountered that kind of problem and how they've addressed it. But in my world, a large part of what I think I'm doing is just teaching both evaluators themselves and the people that are asking for the evaluations to be done or requiring them to be done, because it's part of the administrative legal package that goes with getting money. Just to recognize that being rigorous, as we often say now, like that word is just 99% associated with methodology. It assumes that all the serious claiming about that you will do or engage in around an intervention centers on the rigor of your methodology. And I'm thinking I just think that's very necessary, but very deeply insufficient for drawing accurately, not just inferences about impact, but then even bigger questions in some sense about the generalizability of those claims. So even if we do have a defensible impact in a context X at scale Y for community Z, development's also very quickly about trying to replicate and scale these kinds of interventions or to shut them down on the basis of one evaluation. And that seems to me really bizarre that we think that all of the fulcrum of decision-making, both on the internal validity causality space and in the external validity generalizing and scaling space, turns on method. It doesn't just turn on method. In real science, you have scope conditions. You have ways of being able to define the parameters within which outcomes are achieved, the conditions under which these outcomes are achieved. And somehow we lost all of that. At least then, paradoxically, perhaps, the more elite the university, the more obsessed they are with methodology, and when they should be vastly more cognizant of the importance of engaging, having a pragmatic theory, a defensible, reasoned theory that helps to interpret what you're seeing. Evidence isn't ever self-evident. It doesn't tell you anything. It only tells you what it tells you when you filter it through a theory of one kind or another. And the implicit theory at the moment is a straight line theory. Y equals mx plus c. You plug these inputs in, you control for everything, and you get the outcome over an infinitely linear time period. Once you delinearize your impact trajectory, it's a hyperspace of potential. And serious evaluators and the more importantly, the serious decision makers who have the power to then shut you down or to just get too excessively enthusiastic and start running around the world doing all of these things because now we know it works. The real task is pedagogical, it's teaching, helping people to understand that you're being paradoxically unscientific by putting all your chips on methodology. That's not how real science works. Real science is a conversation between theory and method. And we should demonstrate that in our own work. But the paradox or the weirdness of our world is that we live in a world where somehow methodology has trumped everything else. And we're actually become vastly less rigorous, vastly less sophisticated, and actually then vastly less professional in terms of our capacity to be able to engage with 90% of the problems we actually face in development. Some of them can and should be assessed through a very narrow methodology, but the more we have a bigger agenda on our plate, the more we engage with climate change issues, the more we engage with Indigenous communities, the more we engage with the empowerment of minority groups, the more we deal with migration questions as people move from one context to another. All of that has to have some form of theory built into it. And it sounds nerdy to say that in certain circumstances. Maybe we need a less sort of loaded or freighted word than theory, because that sounds pejorative or just pointy-headed. But everyone's got a theory about the change process, about their own family, about their own kids, about their own marriages. Everybody's got a theory. It's just about helping people to be self-conscious of that theory and able to articulate it in ways that then leads to reasoned decision-making and not just reflexive decision-making where I believe it if it comes out of a certain methodology and I don't if it doesn't come out of that methodology. That's a timid field, a non-scientific field that thinks that way.
In the article you wrote in 2019, when do development projects enhance community well-being, you suggest that evaluators should interpret social change within the project dynamics and should upgrade the purpose, status, and sophistication of monitoring, shifting it from an instrument of compliance to a tool for eliciting real-time feedback and learning. And I tune my research very much on this suggestion, trying to imagine an evaluation able to capture social change in fragile context in that flat, line, apparently silent trajectory of change, shifting the focus of the evaluative research from the projects and its performance and its management to the people and their network. in a relational space where change happens undetected and needs to become intelligible through what I call sentimental evaluation. So I would like to spend a few words to explain our audience what is this sentimental evaluation that I have in mind. It's an approach. It's an approach designed to detect social impact in difficult contexts. And the idea came about after my work experience in Somalia, a country that has a governance gap since decades, where international aid is active without apparently having a meaningful impact. And there is this narrative that there is no impact, and that this creates problems to NGOs when they have to be accountable to donors when they have to be accountable to the people on how aid is spent. And my research is tuned on Michael's discourse on trajectories of change, because there is the underlying assumption that the impact is there. It's not true, that there is this narrative that there is no impact is not really helping us understanding what this trajectory of change is. We only need to be able to detect this impact. We only need to probably elaborate sophisticated tools to read that change. And this is what I try to do with my sentimental evaluation. That focuses on people, on their relationship, on their social capital, let's say, on their network, and what this network circulates, what imbues the network with strength and transformative power. And this glue that imbues the network with transformative power, to me, is the sentiment. And I observed this sentiment in the success cases of diaspora development actors, of the Somali diaspora development actors, that to me were outliers in Somalia. They, with their counterparts, I saw their motivational drive, they're motivated by a sentiment of affection, of love towards their country of origin, toward their people. And this makes them succeed and promote development according to their own modality, to their own organizational principles that are rooted in a relational space that diasporas can navigate and strengthen, and that works differently from the way traditional aid works. Why differently? Okay, in general, the idea is that there is a great flexibility in the planning and in the management of an initial idea that is not well-defined, that is quite rough at the beginning, and that develops gradually by testing a solution and eventually diverting from it in case it demonstrates to be wrong or ineffective. So this flexibility is something traditional development is not used to, traditional workers are not used to, and evaluators often consider negatively as a sign of wrong planning or wrong implementation, assuming the validity of the initial plan and the robustness of the fear of change. In my research, I argue that this flexibility and the lack of stringent boundaries are necessary to diaspora to navigate a difficult context, a rapidly changing context, to pull the participation of people rather than pushing for a solution to within a community, and to invest in the strengthening of the relational space around the project that paves the way for the project sustainability in the end. And I would like to offer you a story about, a short story about disobedience over compliance that calls for a space of discretion for diaspora management that needs to be respected by donors and by all actors. And this story is about the construction of a secondary school in a rural area of Somaliland, bordering with Ethiopia. And the secondary school was contested by two villages, each one of them hoping to win the school in their village. And the diaspora waited for 2 years before the communities of the two villages could agree on a suitable solution for everybody. And you know, they followed the process patiently, funded the initiative only once, you know, it was settled. And differently from traditional monitoring techniques, diaspora development actors don't use indicators or graphs to figure out progress. They follow the project through informal means, talking to people, maybe asking for pitches, listening to accounts on the obstacles, taking part into local discussions. And this peer monitoring system that is fully documented, is not based on reports, but highly participated. And it's dominated by a consensus, by a faith among actors that muddling through will prevail sooner or later, may stand as a disobedience from most donors' rules. Compliance with traditional project time would have prevented diaspora waiting for 2 years to settle an agreement, would have forced probably a decision, a logic decision on the most logical location where to build the school. Instead, disobedience by the diaspora allowed ownership sentiments to take root in the two villages' education committees, fostering their empowerment and mutual collaboration. And there are many peculiarities of the way diaspora promote development, and I will not discuss now for reason of time, but what I want to share with you is a reflection elicited from all the cases I saw from the field. And the reflection is about the motivational drive of diaspora activism, the why they may be such committed development actors. And this drive is, to me, the sentiment. And this sentiment entails a moral dimension that encompasses the need to care for others. So to my surprise, all these projects were, although these projects were poorly projected, let's say poorly planned, under-resourced, under-financed, many of them succeeded in their objective to promote change. And how was this? In the talk I gave to last month at the Harvard Kennedy School, I answered this question by highlighting 3 factors. To me, these 3 factors are these 3 key success points are the sentiment, which is the motivational drive, sharing, the capacity of diaspora people to create a network of supporters around the project, to pool resources, and the technical capacity to manage a project. Of course, this needs to be there. However, these 3 if you look at these 3 key facts, not key facts, I don't want to take your words, but these 3 the elements of success, apart from the capacity building component that is always there, I mean, the international aid is heavily investing in capacity building of development actors. Apart from the capacity building, both the sentiment and the sharing, to me, are like neglected areas of, forgotten areas in development policies and in projects and in evaluation as well. So I was wondering if people with their motivational drive can determine the success of projects, why to neglect this sentimental dimension in the evaluation, in evaluation in the project cycle. So I began dreaming of an evaluation approach that accounts for this sentimental dimension to promote change more effectively in complex contexts and to better understand the dynamics of change that the projects then generate. And I propose changing the scale of observation, as you also suggest, and look at the micro level of project implementation, which to me is this sentimental level. So during my time at Harvard, I did a deep dive into this sentiment, right? Trying to understand more on what this sentiment is and its origins, limits. and how it was conceived maybe in the past by Adam Smith, by Albert Hirschman, in The Passion and the Interest in Morality and the Social Sciences, and also by Judith Tendler in her evaluative research of development projects. And I try to figure out how an evaluation that accounts for sentiments in development may be. So what I'm asking you is to comment whether you agree that, you know, this sentimental dimension is kind of neglected from the development discourse. Why is this? Go ahead.
Unless the short answer is it neglected? Yes. Why is it neglected? Because for the kind of reasons that James Scott articulates in Seeing Like a State, all this stuff is very hard for our administrative systems to apprehend, to engage with, to understand, to monitor and measure and aggregate and disaggregate. It's very specific to a specific group of people. The slightly longer answer, I think, is to, and the case for why it should be taken vastly more seriously than it is to go back to our hero, Albert Hirschman. I opened the paper that you referred to before in this Case for Case Studies book with a quote from Hirschman that I'll paraphrase. It basically says, the only way to understand general things is to understand specific things really well. And a very nice paradoxical kind of statement from Hirschman, but from Development Projects Observed, where he basically said, look, in effect, everything I understand about development is not because I read 10,000 books on it, it's because I spent 1,000 hours work trying to understand just how one particular intervention was occurring. And it wasn't just because I was paid to be there to try and look at one set of mechanisms and how they connected some inputs to some outcomes and some impacts. The essence of the most interesting projects is that there's a whole range of inputs going through a whole bunch of mechanisms and driving a whole bunch of outcomes. And we're there professionally, usually to engage with a very narrow slice of that spectrum, just as our eyesight, human eyesight, is only capable of seeing a very narrow part of the full spectrum of light that other creatures can see at nighttime, for example, that we can't see. It's not that there isn't light there, it's just our eyes aren't built to be able to see that. And I think the same is true with a lot of evaluation, is that we are paid to look through a very narrow set of lenses on one particular thing, because that's the rationale for the intervention. It's the reason that lots of money potentially has been given to it, why potentially hundreds, even thousands of people have dedicated a period of their life trying to make this happen. So we need to make decisions and inferences about whether and how this has worked. But I think a richer, truer evaluation would create space for saying, wow, if this is actually transforming people's lives, it won't just be because they do better on a test of their learning outcomes in mathematics, because that's what a particular test can show us, whether education is working or not. If you put kids in a school and they've never been to one before, you're completely altering how they're going to understand their world. If you make them literate where previously they weren't literate, you don't just measure that by how they go on a vocabulary test or on a spelling bee, and that's your measure of their learning. It may be necessary to have those kind of measures because the rest of the world will understand that they used to get 10% on their tests and now they're getting 80%. Wow, voila, that's impact. Yay, the project works. What about the fact that you just taught them about the stars in the sky at nighttime? And they, like Aboriginal people in Australia, have a whole tens of thousands of years of storytelling about why those stars are there, how you navigate with them, how they teach you about your ancestors, how you can make sense of your entire world just by looking up at the stars at night, right? And now you're teaching a class in astronomy and you're talking about constellations of stars in the Milky Way, and you're talking about Earth rotating around the sun and the sun part of one particular galaxy in the midst of other galaxies. You completely altered how they think cosmologically about the universe. What does that do to people's heads when they have tens of thousands of years of understanding the world in one particular way, and now you educate them? formally in a normal schoolish type of way, and give them entire different software in their head. I think you drive people nuts. I think you make life very complicated for people. You're asking them to coexist in two very different epistemological worlds. You're saying, okay, you can have your way of understanding the world, but here's a different way of understanding the world. This is what people called scientists and astronomers do for a living. They stare into telescopes and they look out into the sky and don't just see sparkly things flashing away up there. They see a whole ordered world that they're trying to make sense of. Well, other people look up at the same sky and see little things flashing in the sky, but they see something really, really, really different. More grounded, like how you grow crops, how you help your animals to be safe and grow to maturity. You can have a very particular graduates in agronomy and animal husbandry tell you how to do that. You can ask village elders who've been raising sheep for 50 years to tell you how to go about doing that. Those are really different ways of knowing. And how do you respect existing ways of knowing, and look at how those particular forms are changing? If the only metric on the outcome space that you've got is milk produced by the cows, that's easy to measure. That everybody understands that a healthy cow produces milk, so let's just go with that as the metric on the outcome space. But maybe you think about the cow. Once it was sacred to you, if you're in India, right? Well, are you desacralizing your cows by turning them into milk production machines that are just there as an asset to be bought and sold? What does that do to people's whole understanding of how sacred and profane activities are conducted in their life? Development's doing all that kind of stuff. And I want people to be much more aware of all of that. So all that trajectory stuff that we're talking about before is not that is just really saying that's one way to understand how a narrow set of inputs are connected to a narrow set of outcomes. But in the hyper-complex space that development actually is by design creating and enacting itself in, you're blowing up all sorts of worlds by doing these nice things like building roads and irrigating fields and introducing new healthcare systems and putting kids in schools. All the stuff that we agree on, it's not even particularly controversial, as well agreed upon targets manifest in the Sustainable Development Goals and everything else. Let alone the harder ones, like what we do with Uganda at the moment, that has just declared LGBTQ people criminal by virtue of their very status in life. What is the rest of the world supposed to do with that? World Bank's suspended operations right now. Okay, but is that being neo-colonial, or is that being standing up for international human rights and agreements that the Ugandan government itself is a signatory to? Really wrenchingly hard questions to answer there. And if all you've got is in your head is a does it work singularity, a thumbs up or down calculation, you match that then to a very singular way of doing methodological work, and only one methodological tool really counts as serious, rigorous basis for claim making, then you just set up a world in which dialogue and conversation around hard questions is just not impossible. It's just so constrained. It's just so limited in terms of the vocabulary it can deploy, the people it can incorporate in the meeting, the people who actually understand what's going on in the meeting. All of that you lose by not being able to engage with these broader questions around sentiment, about how it affects people emotionally, how it affects the software in their own minds, about how they understand stuff that's of primal significance to them. And they're not pretending that development experts, by virtue of have that title granted to them, then have warrant to run into those people's worlds and start changing it in particular ways. Because I think we have to be vastly more modest and humble in recognizing that there's already a way of dealing with these situations in place. It's part of the light spectrum that we probably can't see when we show up. And again, as I tell my Harvard students, the more elite your university, probably the narrower, the deeper that bandwidth is. Being very self-intentional about having a broader set of access to the light spectrum, to the hearing spectrum, to the smell spectrum, all these things that humans always are just very limited in terms of what they can do as a species, let alone what we then train people to do. all of that has got to be just done more differently. But that's expensive. It takes time and it takes money to do all that kind of stuff. And we just don't have the time and the money. So we are a very risk-averse field. We're a very resource-constrained field. We're politically paranoid about all the work we do. We're just one populist critique away from being gutted because this is wasted money on people we don't care about in a part of the world we have no geostrategic interest in. So let's just build lots of sunflowers. Let's just do lots of things that produce flashy outcomes in the short run because that makes us feel good, and call that development work. And I don't think any profession that took itself seriously would think that that was acceptable.
Otherwise, you could bring donors and doers in a different relationship, maybe more collaborative. Yeah. And this is what the sentimental evaluation aims to do.
Yeah. I think countries like Sweden, for example, are really, like, they explicitly have what they call sort of a trust development strategy. Like they said, we don't want to get people to fill out 50-page documents and write not just quarterly reports, but some monthly reports that we can go back to our parliamentary committees and say, see, great stuff's happening. And let them have the time and the space to figure out their own priorities and their own time and space to figure out their own solutions. And our job as a development partner is to work with people over a long enough period of time that we earn their trust and they earn ours. Mm-hmm. And then we just don't have to spend all of our lives fretting about the next report and making up numbers to making it look like we're achieving great things. We just let time unfold and trust that people navigate their own world way probably better than we do, way better than we do. Mm-hmm. And so it's not impossible to do this. That's my point. And I think we have at least individual country programs. And I think Germany does a pretty good job of that as well, a very explicit commitment to hiring local people, to doing local work, all of that sort of little things like that actually make a big difference. But ultimately require a lot of trust, not just in your own people, but within your own minders, the people back in your capital city who pay your bills, who pay your salary, who are one election mood away from having a whole new cast of characters come in who just want to ride roughshod over this, look around and say, oh, the sentimental stuff is sentimental in English. It's just cute. It's emotional, but that's not what real work is about. It's about hard numbers. It's about rigorous evidence. It's about formal claim making, and all this stuff then just bounces out really quickly. So it's inherently vulnerable, but so is a lot of stuff we do in life.
Yes. And trust is a key word in this sentimental evaluation that, to me, unfolds within a relationship of faith and trust and mutual esteem between all actors that are involved in a change trajectory, in a development project, including donors. I mean, probably the issue is not only to hire staff, to hire local staff, but to engage with local development actors in a different way, in a more probably equitable way, as if it is a relationship of a couple. Imagine exactly like in a couple, you have you have faith, you have love, you have a project, a common project. The same way, donors may engage with doers, with local partners, in a way that creates, they understand, they talk to each other, they understand, they agree on an objectives, they acknowledge their sentiments toward the project, their aim, their ultimate goal. And they they commit themselves to invest on the project, and they create this space of psychological safety that, to me, is conducive to positive change. Mm-hmm. So I propose that a sentimental evaluation would be based on a few principles. The first would be to be based on individuals, and then it creates relationships of trust and psychological safety among development actors, including donors. Then it builds and supports individuals' motivation, that is the powerful drive that leads to success. It allows flexibility and personal initiative. It gives discretion in the project management rather than compliance to plans and frameworks. And then it detects the sentiment in the various phases of the project, designing monitoring tools that account for people's happiness, well-being, and social inclusion. Is this true utopian, or is it something that is possible?
I think, well, at least in the World Bank, every single project has a 5% of its allocated amounts given over to this thing we call M&E, monitoring and evaluation. And my sense is that we've had an evaluation revolution of sorts, not a good one, but a revolution nonetheless, on being at least doing evaluation more systematically than we have before. But I still think that space has been taken over by a monopoly that's just not helpful. But I think within that space, there's an enormous scope for an equivalent revolution in the M space, the monitoring space. And as you indicated before, monitoring is a compliance tool now. It's a sort of slap your wrist kind of tool. To no, you weren't supposed to do that. You didn't procure your contracts in the right way, and so naughty you as a bad bureaucrat. And so people fear it because it's if they don't, this becomes the way in which you'll be asked to account for yourself to an auditing committee, and nobody wants to have to do that. It's awful, right? So we make it bureaucratic life. We can make it very awful for people just by setting up an M system that notionally is about trying to track progress, but really ends up just becoming, in a paranoid world, a space where we try to avoid a bad headline. And in development, we're always spooked about having a bad headline, because we can do 95% of things fine, but then 5% of them get a headline and get on the front page of a national newspaper, and then all of that good work seems to be undone. So everybody's really paranoid about this stuff. But in a better world, we would say, especially in developing country context, especially around in fragile state type situations, and especially in sectors where that work is just itself inherently really hard to do, we have to be much more attuned to building out better monitoring systems. For my sins at the moment at the World Bank, I'm part of a review process of the Global Environment Facility, which is a huge big trust fund that does work, as the name suggests, on environmental issues. And to the director's great credit, I get this email out of the blue from her saying, we existed for 30 years, but we've never done a serious evaluation of our worst performing projects. Not that we can all tell happy stories about our good ones, but we've either suppressed the bad ones or just not treated them as learning moments. We saw them as ones to be ashamed of or to be embarrassed about. And so this is, I think, very brave leadership to sort of air your dirty laundry, as it were, but not because you want to shame the people that probably took on a really tough project in a really tough place and it just proved too difficult. But rather, what kinds of learning systems can we build out of this that help us to, not just in a more due diligence sense, be more able to detect disaster before it hits, or to be able to respond in a technical way to design problems, but how do we actually build out more sophisticated monitoring systems to be able to help these projects adapt in real time to the kinds of changes that are occurring. Dan Honig's book, I think this 2018 book on development by judgment, judgment and discretion being a key basis on which you do the navigating. He's got this killer graph in there, but he's looking at the most complex projects and then the extent to which real-time adjustments were able to be made. And it's the straightest line, I think, that's ever been produced in social science, showing that the more complex you are and the less you adapt, the worse the outcomes you're going to get, period. Like almost as in a law-like kind of way, not just scatter plots with points on a graph going everywhere. It's a line. And I hope that kind of finding becomes really baked in to how we think about things, because I think if we can recognize that even if we're going to be paranoid about things, we're not, we need to become much more able to learn about how to do what we do. The reason planes don't fall out of skies is because they have really good monitoring systems to be able to track and understand why bad things happen when planes go off course, where they fall off runways. We can engage in this incredibly complex, otherwise very risky task called getting into a metal tube and flying at 600 miles an hour at 36,000 feet in the air, and do that with 99.9% confidence that we're going to land, because we've got learning systems all over the world that have figured out how to keep metal tubes in the air doing that kind of work. That I've been on a committee once, actually, on a super weird event that I got asked to speak on, where I was on a committee with me, a guy from the National Transport Safety Board, and NASA, like the guys that put astronauts into space, and me. And it was beautifully shaming for me to look at. Here are the astronauts, here are the pilots. These guys could go on for hours about the ways in which they have built out all of their systems to be able to anticipate and resolve these problems, such that we can do this amazing kind of work, because these systems are perpetual learning organizations. Development's not a perpetual learning organization. It's a perpetually afraid professional space where a lot of very diligent, good people are trying to do things despite the systems they work in, not because of them. And if we were able to have our own little revolution, it would be in this M space, I think, not in the evaluation space. We've already got enough tools in that. The revolution needs to be happening in the acceptance of the broadness of that space, so that realist evaluations and other tools are just given more oxygen to breathe. That's a different kind of evaluation revolution. But the monitoring evaluation is a whole array of work that we need to do as a profession to be much better at this, but not just in a heart rate, blood pressure kind of easy to measure and aggregate and use lots of apps on phones and everything else that'll make it look really sexy when we're doing this stuff. Human sentiments are deeply part of all of this, and it's not able to be apt. It's not able to be heart rated and blood pressured into neat little metrics that we can put on a little ticker and sort of show that things are. None of us want to be treated like that. And as Valeria knows from how I concluded my class last week, I have this wonderful quote from Hirschman that actually most people don't know about, because it comes from an interview that he did and it was published in an obscure book that nobody's ever read. But it's a magic, one of the many magical quotes from Hirschman, and it basically says, we don't want a social science that figures everybody out. Once humans have actually been reduced to a formula or to a comprehensive body of knowledge, we're just vastly less interesting people. We like it to be, we don't want to be understood. It's okay to have inherently partial knowledge about who we are and how we behave and how we respond to all sorts of stuff going on in our lives. What we really do need, though, is for some version of that to be reverse engineered back into the way in which we engage with these change processes. And the independent evaluation group has done work on those interventions in the World Bank over the last 2 years and last decade. In 2014, they did one, and it just did a big one in 2021 as well, on the extent to which these projects work in fragile states. And the conclusion, rightfully, of very good sort of meta-evaluations is that they work when they are able to engage in, take context seriously, and not just the project doesn't work. It's the people and the systems that together with the intervention figure out how to work together. And that's a very different conclusion than saying, does intervention X work in the abstract? It's saying, when do they work? Under what conditions do they work? What kinds of key facts do you need to know in order to be able to make these generalizing questions, these scaling questions, these replication questions? And all of that is where a richer set of tools is required. And the part of that, whether we call it action research, or whether we call it realist research, or any of the other many names that other branches of social science put on the kind of work they're doing, ultimately, what it's trying to do is to elicit this and get some formal apprehension of a very different world. And I'm all for trying to do that, as long as it's not manipulative, as long as it's not seen as yet another little tool we can wield against people to get them to nudge this way rather than that way in terms of their reproductive health, for example. All these other really invasive incursions into people's lives and their bodies there's still a lot to be done there, but when it's done right and it's done in ways that we ourselves, upholding the golden rule, essentially, saying are we treating other people the way we would want to be treated in these circumstances? If that's the criteria, the basic philosophical moral principle we apply, then I think we would be doing much more work that's in this sentiment space than in the clinical engineering surgical kind of model, where we think that our job as smart people is to quickly decide what the problem is, strike with great precision on that one, on extracting the problem or closing the gap. Once we think like that, we're just assuming powers to ourselves that we don't have and we shouldn't have.
Thank you very much, Michael. I would take the opportunity to open the floor to our public to listen at maybe Massimo or Nicoletta opinion about this, and also to get questions from, yes, Massimo, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It has been a fascinating conversation between you two. And I had many, how can I say, many thoughts when you were talking. One of the things that I thought about was how the World Bank has changed. I worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Italy as a social development advisor. And I remember at the time of Wolfenson, as a president, the World Bank, let's say in inverted commas, discovered social development in a different way. At the time, there was Michael Chernea, and it was much more lonely than you are, I think, at the time. And in a way, it was interesting to see also how social development advisors with a strong background in social science from donor institutions tried to interact with the new president and actually grabbed an opportunity that was given by this new presidency in order to influence or aim at influencing different aspects of the work at the World Bank, including evaluation. I was a member of that group at the time, and I remember we had also a meeting with the director of the evaluation office. And one of the things that we asked him was, are you able to keep track of the failures in the work of the World Bank and compare that with the career progress within the World Bank? Is there any relationship between projects that are considered to be failures and the career performance of those who have been managing? And he candidly said that the two things are unrelated. You can have a very good career, and that is true actually in other places where I worked. You can have a very good career irrespective of whether the projects that you work on are considered to be a failure or a success. But this means that probably a career in an organization depends on other elements than those that are related to a metrics, an evaluation metrics that reports back to donors or taxpayers, probably focusing only on the good news, on the positives, as you said. So this means that these institutions should also be evaluated. How the World Bank, how other donors think and work and act should be more evaluated. And I'm trying to do this also in the organization that I'm working now in, which deals with democracy building. And one of the things that we tried to do was to bring together those who are working on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and those who are working on project management, bringing them much closer with perhaps also approaches that might undermine in the ideal world the independence of evaluation, but may influence and impact more on the design in terms of learning. That is one thing. And the other thing is that since we are, as many other institutions, an institution that has headquarters and then country and regional offices, try to generate more interaction between these different parts of the institution, because what we noticed is that while the stories of what has not worked are known in certain pockets within the institution, then this is not known in other pockets of the institution. And so that sort of internal communication should be established. And I think that we should also work on these, how we communicate, how not only how formally we comply with the procedures, rules, but also how do we communicate what we know, what we learn, and what we should stop doing within the institution. So I'm very much in favor of ethnographic approaches to institutional learning, and that is what I'm trying to do in my organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo.
May I say something?
Of course, you're very welcome.
No, well, Michael, first of all, thank you very much for this introduction to both of you. And I am fascinated by your long-term, unexpected theory of change, in the sense that I see that you have an idea of development and how it unfolds in a way that is not captured by the experience and the theories and the methodologies of the who else is doing evaluation in this field. And I was very much interested in what you were saying in the first part of the conversation, because you said at some point that, I quoted, real science is a conversation between theory and method. And I agree completely. And I know that there has been an enormous debate on methods, especially at the beginning of the thinking about evaluation. But at a certain point, it seemed that introducing the idea of theory of change could be a shift from relying completely and only on methodology, and on the other hand, having putting methodology at the service of a theory of change, and making methodology a tool for something, but not the real thing. And I noticed that all the guidelines, or even of the main agencies now, impose having a theory of change in order to evaluate something. So they have utilized the idea of a theory of change and reduced it at a poor methodological tool. And the prevalence of methodology is still there, even if utilizing the idea and the concept of the theory of change should have completely altered their way of looking at things. And this, I think, is really important, because now everybody speaks of theory of change. And the theory of change but if they introduce the way that the kind of methodology, and also the practice, because one is the methodology of so-called robust method, etc., but also the practice of monitoring that you were saying is all based on something that has nothing to do of allowing the understanding of how things happen. Because I think that a great distinction is between asking whether a program works or asking how change happens. Really, we are interested in how change happens. Development is how change happens. It is how development takes place. So if we look at from this point of view, we could even say, and I would like sometime to say, that even methodology should suit the idea of how things change, how change happens. So in a sense, it is not that we are not interested in methodology, but we want a methodology that supports our way of looking at change in the way that you are saying. So in the long run, with an understanding the unintended consequences, etc., and all what you have said. So from this point of view, I think that we should. I am very curious about your experience, because you live in an environment at the World Bank that I suppose that you feel this difficulty in bringing your ideas to the people you are working with, because how can you pass your ideas of this how change happens in an environment where everybody thinks that the only problem is how the program, if the program works or not?
Good. I mean, I can answer that, but I've said enough already. I'd rather have a few more voices contribute to the conversation before we finish up.
There are many things to say, but I really enjoyed so much your presentation, and it goes beyond your book. There was a lot of experience beyond what we have read of your articles, etc. And this is what we really enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, Laura.
Yes, maybe I want to say a couple of comments. First of all, thank you both for all the insights you produce with your conversation. You touched a lot of things that are very sensitive, and just yesterday, the first comment is that just yesterday we were speaking about with Nicoletta, how this kind of approach that has a more attention to the sentiment of people, to unexpected results, to the context where the intervention is implementing, need not only a long time of observation in the field, so maybe more a budget that allow this, but also sometimes it's an issue of sensitivity. So how to teach evaluators to have this kind of sensitivity when they approach an evaluation, because it's something that is difficult to teach. There is no capacity building program that teach you how to be sensible to some changes, to discover the unexpected, to be surprised at how a possible failure can be a path for development in some places and in some contexts. So this is my first thought. And the second one is that I think that in the discourse of evaluation, we are doing some steps in this direction, because there are a lot of authors, a lot of discourse on context related evaluation, on how we have to value local knowledge, how we have also to include elements, intangibles and not miserables like sentiment. But then there is a gap in between what we think, what we write in our papers, what we discuss in our conference, and the real field of the evaluation. So the term of reference, the commissioners that are still not so open-minded, and the big risk is that we bridge this limited view of doing monitoring and evaluation also in the field, because I was facilitating a focus group a few months ago online in Puntland in a project, and they were discussing the same field officers, they were discussing about the results of the project. And some of them said, okay, we increased the production of date pounds with our intervention, and others of the same group, they say, no, we are not increasing the production because we have the prolonged drought, so we cannot write down officially that we increased the production because this was affected by drought, so we have no right baseline to demonstrate this and this and this. So I was with my eyes completely open, because we are teaching them to think how we are thinking and writing in the global north. And this is a completely a crash of the system in development aid. And yeah, so these are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Marina, Giulia, Tommaso. Maybe while you're making up your mind, Michael may start answering.
No. These are conversations that can't be resolved in 6 minutes that we have left, obviously. I think we, again, to invoke our hero, we all have a bias for hope, right? You wouldn't sustain a career in this field if you were fundamentally pessimistic or wanting to think that that change was both desirable and somehow possible. Maybe not within one's own lifetime. I am resigned to a lot of that, and what you can't be a sociologist of history and not be continuously inspired by people that took on crazy business and tasks, maybe because they themselves are a bit crazy, but history was very kind to them, and people have done the same thing, and history's been very unkind to them because they were actually doing really silly things. So I think there's an inherent unresolvability about some of these things that we just have to ourselves make peace with. But back to more formally in this whole language of a theory of change, for example, I think that Nicola's right in the sense that you'll see that expression being invoked, but I think, and again, in a pretty narrow mechanical sort of way, that if I turn the keys on in my car, there's a series, the theory of change is that the very act of turning on those keys ultimately ignites my engine, enables the car to grow and to roll along a road and for me to control it. So we have this, a very mechanical and as necessary, a mechanisms-based understanding of what the theory of change is. And it's built around essentially the log frame or the administrative instruments that we construct, because they have to have this thing called a theory of change that justifies that these inputs are going to produce those outcomes. And that's reasonable. That's not, it's not that should be articulated as such. The bigger capital T theory of capital C change is, as you said, how is development in its fullest sense transforming societies in its fullest sense by this thing called development happening. And when that happens in the happiest of circumstances, let alone when it happens in the more complex situations where something sort of happens some of the time, and actually most of the time things kind of don't really go anywhere. I'm working in Papua New Guinea at the moment, for example, on a big education reform initiative, and we're 18 months into that. How much progress have we actually made? Not much. It's really, really hard to function there when a country with 7 million people and 820 languages. I think it isn't a singularity. There isn't a constituency that a theory of change has to be a hyperspace of activity. But we're trying to reform an education system where no one actually knows how many teachers there are in the country. Nobody knows how many students there are in the country, and nobody knows how many school buildings there are actually in the country. So pretty elementary material is not there. And despite not knowing any of those 001 level of administrative knowledge, somehow kids learn in those schools. Somehow kids actually figure out how to add, how to multiply, how to write a serious sentence in English or in their native language, or which there are many. So part of what we're trying to do is sort of what an earlier colleague of mine called fiscal ethnography, which is like tracking the money, or like where does a lot of these principals in schools will complain about that we just haven't got the money that we need, and it's not because the money's not being allocated, it's just the money never arrives. Okay, so where are the leak points in this pipeline? And once you ask those kind of questions, man, then you're poking at lots of bears, right? You're asking really hard questions because you know actually pretty well where that money's going, and or at least somebody does. But there's a whole code of silence around all of that. And again, in a narrow sort of theory of change, we think that the machine itself has its own sort of functional powers. Then there's a manager or a director or an overseer of some kind who has magical powers to be able to turn the engine on and off when it needs to be. And then there's this thing called a context, which is or is not favorable or conducive to that kind of activity occurring. And then there is a bigger sort of theory of change that says, what is it in that, or when you add all of that up, what is it reasonable to expect to happen? And what might you even begin, what sort of unknown unknowns might there be out there that might be happening despite all of your best efforts, despite all of the worst efforts to suppress this system or to be able to siphon off its resources for your own personal gain. There's just so many different ways in which this can all flow out. And so fiscal ethnography kind of work, I think, is actually really interesting to be able to help turn an administrative tool called a theory of change into an actual theory, and where that term is not invoked pejoratively, but it's really just an explanation of what's going on, and more particularly how it's going on and for whom it is going on. And evaluators have all the tools really in their kit already to kind of deal with all of that. And that's why I come back to the pedagogy of all of this. It's really about helping paranoid decision makers who can be very easily sold on on an understanding of their job as being able to be a steward of pouring resources into one end of a pipeline and just be with high confidence that something narrow but measurable and photographable will come out the other end, and saying that's no understanding of how your country became what it is or my country became what it is got there by having a deep understanding of all those particular mechanisms. It happened in ways that we only can understand retrospectively often. We can only understand try to understand the causes of the effects rather than the effects of the causes. And once you're trying to get people to think up and down in a reverse kind of way, when all the incentives in elite academia are just to be able to double down or triple down on a very narrow slice of all of that, a theory of change comes to mean just a very narrow thing in and of itself, rather than being more perspicacious, shall we say, in terms of understanding of change processes. And that's most of it's pedagogical to me. It's about being relentlessly patient with people and then waiting for these serendipitous moments when you get an email out of the blue from someone who runs a global environmental facility and says, I want to try and look at our worst 30 projects over the last 30 years, and I want us to learn from it. I said, wow, okay, I'm crazy busy right now, but this is the moment. I've been asked to write as a white guy to write help co-author the World Bank's gender empowerment strategy right now, right? Yikes, what the heck am I doing that? Well, I'm doing that because the particular director of that is very astute around these kinds of issues. And for whatever reason, she's in this position of power to be able to really guide a much more nuanced understanding of change processes that isn't just mechanical. It's trying to recognize that change processes can be really bad for men sometimes, and that's really there's a whole constituency that doesn't want to have that sort of stuff on the table, and she really wants that stuff on the table. So I don't know, that's why you work at a place for a long time. You stick at things for a long time. You don't see your own theory of change built around, I'm going to enact change in a year because I'm an awesome human being. So, no, I'm going to show up for work every day. That's all I'm ever going to do. I'm going to show up for work, and I'm going to somehow believe that offering up my little bit in the way that I do will stick. I don't know my theory of change is I don't know for sure that's going to stick, but if I do it long enough and with enough conviction and enough reason and enough support, that somehow it'll stick. And that's all. But whether you're trying to whatever particular tough issue you're engaging with in life, it's probably going to require that sort of term of commitment in order to be able to change it. And that's what another part of what your theory of change should tell you about yourself is that you're not awesome. Whatever you do is part of a team, and that team itself has got to be just very astute in terms of benchmarking and calibrating its own expectations of itself in the short run, but its own vision of what that change process might look like, and figure out how to partner with people higher up the food chain who won't universally see this, but may somehow over time come to embrace it. And I think the hyperspace of development that we're in right now actually does create moments where, or spaces for these kinds of initiatives to be launched. And I happen to be fortunate to be at a time in my career when I'm getting asked to be part of these things. I've been part of an amazing process on in Canada, trying to deal with reparations for all the awfulness conducted by the Canadian government against its native populations for 100 years around taking children away from their parents, putting them in mission schools and foster homes. And they're really trying to figure out how do we have that conversation about how we spend this money, how we account for this money, how do we create an environment of trust where First Nations people have got centuries worth of disillusionment and violence and rejection of anything that the Canadian government's tried to do in the name of child welfare. How can we have a different kind of conversation? And being in those rooms when those conversations happen, it's magical, just because you see this is what humans are capable of when they create a world for themselves where they can have these hard conversations and not just make it brinksmanship, not make it one-upmanship, or I'm smarter than you, my theory's better than your theory. Just negotiate. And that always gives me hope that people are actually capable of doing this. They just need real leadership and real space and real resourcing to make it real.
Thank you very much. Nicoletta.
Oh, no. I don't want to add anything, but just to say that I noticed in a textbook of something from the World Bank, I found this quote: if we found something which is serendipitous, we do not have to take it into consideration because it can be by chance. And we are not interested with chance. We are interested in realizing whether what we, because we are something like an evidence organization or a factual organization or something. We are interested in whether what we wanted to do really works. And so there is, I wrote an exact refutation to look at unintended positive consequences. But as you say, they are very good in finding out what went wrong. This is something that also Judith always said, that very often they are able to understand what doesn't work and are not interested in finding what really may work in a different way as expected. And all what you are saying is looking at different ways as expected, because change may happen in a way that is not expected. We do not understand. We cannot forecast it since the beginning, but it may happen. And this is the idea of process tracing. But in general, it is an idea that we need to take into consideration the ability to look at something that may happen in a different way than expected. And this is something that I think should enter into the way we prepare the people who are going to do evaluation or are going to work in this field of development, which is something which is rare to get, but I get it from your teaching.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. Thank you all. I think it's time to
enjoy Friday evening.
Yeah. So Laura, we'll leave you the floor to close the session, to say goodbye, everybody.
No, thank you, Valeria. You were very exhaustive, and it was a pleasure to have you both from the other part of the ocean. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. And yes, we hope this is the first part of the conversation. Maybe we will involve you in a second. So take care.
Just invite me. I'm very happy to learn from you guys, because I know one little slice of the world, and but there's lots of other slices.
A little bit more than one little slice.
In the grand scheme of things, it's still one little slice, but I immerse myself in detail, and then I take the Hirschmanian step of then proclaiming all sorts of things that are more general. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you. Really, it was an honor for us to have you as a guest today, and thank you, Valeria, for organizing everything. So thanks.
Thank you again.
Have a nice day.
You
Yeah.
too. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Tommaso. Thank you. Bye, Marina. Bye, Giulia. Bye,
Bye.
Nicola. Ciao, Laura.
Thanks very
Bye.
much.
Voila.